you this morning, Ambassador Aharoni. This is supposed to be kind of a BYOB, bring your own bagel or challah roll conversation so that our community and our Jewish community, well beyond Congregation Road of Sholem, can become educated about the significance of the Abraham Accords, a real milestone in Israeli diplomacy. So we want to start off our conversation this morning, Ambassador Aharoni, by asking you about the context of how all of this came to be. What were the factors that led to the achievement of the Abraham Accords? What fell into place to allow it to happen? And what had been missing until that moment?
Well, there are many factors, but first let me thank you for inviting me, and I'm so impressed by the scope of this event, how many people and the planning. I really thank you, and it's much appreciated. There are many factors that play into this. This is one of those rare situations that there's nothing bad about it. You know, from whichever way you look at the Abraham Accord, it is a positive development. It is a positive development for those who support peace. There's a positive development even for those who are asking, and we will be asking today, what about the Palestinians? Even there, I think there's some good news for the Palestinians. So there are several major factors that play in here. The first is, of course, U.S.-China tension. China has made tremendous progress in establishing presence, especially in major seaports in the region. And of course, the United States was interested in establishing or making its presence more felt. Secondly, Iran. Iran, although the main motivation for Iran to acquire non-conventional weapons is not necessarily, historically speaking, related to Israel. It's more related to their desire to acquire or obtain hegemony in the region, and because of their perception of themselves as a minority nation, a small Shiite minority in a sea of Sunnis. And so Iran's role in the region created new divisions, and Israel all of a sudden finds itself on the same side as Saudi Arabia and the GCC countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council. And then, of course, a third reason for this is the fact that the oil reserves of the oil nations are depleting rapidly, especially now when Joe Biden is entering the White House with there's a great expectation that he will put the climate change issue at the center of the agenda, at the top of the agenda. So looking for a way to transition their economies from an economy that is based on natural resources to an economy that is based on knowledge. And when those young leaders in the Gulf nations looking around, looking for a potential strategic partner, then obviously Israel is the natural ally. And this is exactly what's happening. Now, having said all of that, we have to remember and give credit where credit is due. The ties, the diplomatic ties between Israel and the Gulf countries did not start yesterday. This is the culmination of decades of work of Israeli diplomats, of Israeli intelligence officers, of Israeli leaders. We had already ties with Oman and with Qatar, and we had an economic representation in Abu Dhabi before the Abraham Accord. We had embassies in Morocco and Tunisia before. This all ended with the Second Intifada. And of course, Israel had ties already with Sudan before. You know, we could not have brought all the newcomers from Ethiopia without establishing diplomatic ties and back channels with the Sudanese government. So all of that already happened decades ago. And I think that the reason why it happened now, to your question, what's the missing element, I think is the sense of urgency. We need to transition our economy to a knowledge-based economy. Israel is the ally.
The language of these accords, Ambassador, is stunning and I think unprecedented. promoting interfaith and intercultural dialogue among the three Abrahamic religions, seeking tolerance and respect for every person. We pursue a vision of peace, security, and prosperity in the Middle East and around the world. Like, yikes. I mean, so digging deeper, do you think that the participants in these accords were, one, trying to send a message to the Palestinians and other actors in the region? And do you think that there were more profound hopes to achieve even some of what this language dictates, and using the accords as a starting point?
Well, I think it's a very, very important and profound question. I don't think that this was done, in order to agitate or irritate the Palestinians. On the contrary, I think that the Palestinians, this was done despite of the Palestinians. The Palestinians, very tragically and sadly, had written themselves off. How? By making a series of terrible mistakes. Let me give you some background. In Israel, we had two major political camps. The bigger one was, the larger of the two, was the one that supported the idea of a territorial compromise. And that was based on the idea that you give the Palestinians what they want, namely territory, and they give you, the Palestinians, what you want, namely peace and security. And that was really, that very simple bargain was the DNA of the territorial compromise. Just to show you how strong that political camp was, that was the camp that brought to power Yitzhak Rabin. And with the support of this camp, Yitzhak Rabin passed the Oslo Accords, and that was the camp that brought Ehud Barak to the prime minister's office. In 2000, something terrible happened to that camp. Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat went to Camp David. Clinton put forth a far-reaching compromise that would have given the Palestinians the vast majority of their territorial demands, but at the end, statehood, and would have given Israel what Israel wanted, which was peace and security. Needless to say, I don't have to tell our viewers that regardless of whose fault is it, it doesn't matter. The fact remains that the summit failed, and shortly thereafter, the Palestinians waged war against Israeli civilians, not Israeli law enforcement. Civilians were the targets. 1,500 people died on our side, 72% of them civilians. As if this was not enough, to end the Second Intifada, Israel's prime minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, of all people, the person who was against territorial compromise, he ends the Second Intifada by doing something that was unthinkable until that point. He pulls out of Gaza unilaterally, thus fulfilling the Palestinian territorial fantasy. He didn't even ask anything in return. He says, here, Gaza is all yours until the last square inch. And of course, we all know what happened. The Palestinians, instead of turning Gaza into the Singapore of the Middle East, they turned it into a launching pad for repeated attacks against Israel. And then lastly, 2008, the last nail in the coffin, Ehud Olmert is offering, according to Condoleezza Rice, 100%, and the Palestinian leader, Abu Mazen, doesn't even respond. What happened as a result? The territorial compromise camp basically dissolved, doesn't exist. So when people say, where is the Israeli left? There is no more left when it comes to foreign policy. And the Israeli left was destroyed by a series of Palestinian decisions not to accept territorial compromise. Now, again, does it set aside all the big issues of what are the ramifications of ruling the lives of another people? No. But the fact remains that the Palestinians lost their number one ally, which was the Israeli public. And that's their biggest problem until this very day. In the process, they also made some other horrendous geopolitical decisions. For example, in the fight between Shiites and Sunnis, they sided with Iran, which is the #1 destabilizer in the region. When the normalization agreements were announced, they were burning the flags of the UAE in Ramallah. Not a very smart move to do, to burn the flags of a country that sends you hundreds of millions of dollars every year to pay the salaries. And so when you're looking at the Arab world today, I think there is a growing realization that with the current leadership, the Palestinians are unable to produce the right level of pragmatism that is needed in the world of diplomacy. The Palestinians, since even before statehood, their foreign policy was based on a zero-sum assumption, meaning what's mine comes at your expense and vice versa, which is really not the essence of diplomacy. Diplomacy is all about creating a win-win situation. And they never really embraced pragmatism. The greatness of Ben Gurion was that he did embrace pragmatism. If not for Ben Gurion's pragmatism, there wouldn't be a state of Israel today.
That was, I think, an incredible history lesson in bringing us to this moment. So, Ambassador, I think what would be really helpful for so many of us who are trying to wrap our minds around what the significance of this moment holds, what do each of the parties stand to gain from being part of the Abraham Accords? Why did Bahrain sign? Why did the UAE sign? You had mentioned that there were flags being burned. So all of a sudden now there's the formalizing of relationships. We understand that from what Rabbi Levine said, that part of the language of the agreement is addressing the idea of greater peace and stability in the region. But many of us are also reading that arms deals and negotiations are going to be part of an outcome in terms of the establishing relationships with these countries, obviously with the United States playing a role as facilitator. So how does that make sense as part of this as well? Can you concretize some of this for us?
Yeah, there's one word that encapsulates everything that you said, and that word is creativity. Why? If in the old days, the #1 commodity or the most sought after commodity was, let's say, salt, hundreds of years ago, and then it became, I don't know what, gold, and then it became oil, then today, the #1 human asset that we are looking for is creativity. Human creativity is the most important thing and the #1 predictor of success in the world. Israel is a tiny country. When I was 11 years old and the Yom Kippur War broke out, we were 3.5 million people. Our GDP was 50% of the combined GDP of all of our neighbors. So if you took the GDP of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and so on, Jordan, Israel's GDP was 50% of their combined GDP, which we, at the time in 73, we thought it was a great achievement. Today, our GDP is 3 times the size of their combined GDP. And the reason is because we became a hub of creativity. How do you become a hub of creativity? How do you become a place with 10,000 startups? How do you become a place that changes the world by introducing new technologies day in and day out? From instant messaging all the way to 360-degree protection to every vehicle, Mobileye and so on. By allowing self-criticism, which is something that we take for granted because of our Jewish, and I'm talking here to 2 rabbis, our Jewish tradition is all about the permission to argue and ask questions, and that's the #1 engine of Israeli creativity. And that also leads to self-criticism. That leads to accountability. If I make a mistake, I take responsibility over my mistake. And when I fail, I try to learn from my failure and not give up and so on. So all those things turned Israel into one of the most attractive hubs of creativity in the world. I would dare to say in the top 5, right? We're not as big as Silicon Valley. We're not as big as New York City, but we are in the top 5. And that is, of course, the main reason why Israel is being sought after so passionately, not only by the Arab countries, by African nations. You know that Israel has the most intimate relations with India ever right now. That's because of the same. Israel today enjoys an unprecedented degree of diplomatic and geopolitical intimacy with the world's greatest powers because of that one word, creativity. And that's the whole story, if you ask me.
Well, let me follow up with your comments and Rabbi Carroll's question. A distinguished journalist in this country, Jeffrey Goldberg, has said this is essentially an arms deal, that these countries were looking for advanced aircraft, hardware, software, the kinds of stuff that they never could get before, and that the Israeli government would lobby hard to make sure that they maintained a superior military advantage. Do you think that things have changed so much and trust has deepened so much that it's okay in Israel's view that these countries get all this stuff and throw in Saudi Arabia into the mix because they won't be far behind? Have we really gone that far?
I don't think so. I think that, you know, in my 25 years in diplomacy, and I really had the privilege of observing up close, you know, Shimon Peres, who was a master diplomat. And I learned in my 25 years in foreign service that at the end of the day, it's your own self-interest that matters. And, you know, we all love to speak about values and shared values and so on. But at the end of the day, you know, it's realpolitik. And when you look at at those countries around us, you know, it doesn't really change much the fact that they will acquire this weapon system or the other weapon system. It doesn't change the fact that Israel's defense philosophy, which was designed and devised by David Ben-Gurion pre-statehood, and stood and still stands on 3 legs, hasn't changed and still remains a stunning success. What are the 3 legs? The first is protection, which means that the job of the State of Israel is to protect not only its citizens. We have a legal contract. We also are obliged to protect Jews. Whether those Jews see themselves as Jews or not, irrelevant. When Israeli IDF were flying into Entebbe to release the Jews, don't forget that Air France airplane, the terrorists were, you know, they divided the passengers. And they told the captain, you're not Jewish, you don't have to stay. And he insisted on staying. He said, these are my passengers, I'm staying with them. By the way, he died last year at the age of 95 in France, the captain of the airplane. Now, you know, we never asked those Jews on the board of the plane if they support Israel, if they're Zionists, maybe they disagree, maybe they support the Palestinians. We have no idea. We had no idea. We had a commitment to save them. And so that was, in order to protect, you have to have a strong army. The IDF is a strong military by any standard. The second leg is prevention. How do you prevent? You prevent by preempting. You look at how Israel destroyed the Iraqi nuclear reactor, the Syrian nuclear reactor in 2006, even the preemption before in June of 1967. This is what you have to do. You have to use a lot of intelligence and make sure that you prevent the actions of your enemy. And thirdly, which is the biggest issue, is deterrence. You have to develop weapon systems that are so advanced, that are so mighty, that your enemy will not even begin to think to mess with you, right? That's the logic. You have to understand, David Ben-Gurion was a genius. 1945, he sees how the war ends, nuclear weapons, and he says to himself, he takes a mental note. 1945, he says to himself, post-statehood, that's what we need. You have to understand, 1948, Israel has absolutely nothing. No economy, no export, no infrastructure. And he's fantasizing about nuclear weapons. It's unheard of. And of course, you look at the combination of those three elements: protection, prevention, deterrence, a stunning success. And whether the UAE or Saudi Arabia will be able to acquire an advanced weapon system is not going to change that. Israel will always maintain its competitive edge and will do whatever it takes. And that's why the relationship with the US administration is so important in that concept.
I think because you spoke, I think very succinctly about some of the mistakes that the Palestinians have made leading up not only to this moment, but just over time as their circumstances have deteriorated and as prospects for peace have also deteriorated in popular conception. We're really wondering what's the Palestinian mindset? Now we see, what is Bahrain and the UAE by signing these accords? What does that say to the world, but also to Palestinians about their relationship to their struggle for national self-determination? And did the signature of these Abraham Accords, even if not explicitly put into the language, were there any expectations that Israel will curtail any settlement behavior or anything else related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Yeah, so I think, and some may think that my position is overly creative. But I actually think that what the U.S. administration did actually long term will help the Palestinians. In what way? Up until Donald Trump introduced his disruptive form of diplomacy, the conventional wisdom was that in order for the United States or the European Union or the United Nations or any other international player, in order for them to be effective, they had to maintain a certain level of even-handedness. And we all familiar with the term honest broker and so on and so forth. But Donald Trump, who's not a diplomat, who's not even a politician, he's a brand, an entertainment brand really, that transitioned into politics. And he came up with this different approach that said, you break it, you pay for it. Meaning the Palestinians rejected at least two very well documented attempts that would have given them independence. So why do I have to be neutral? So he decided to break the traditional American neutrality. And that had a profound impact on the entire discourse. And strangely and oddly, I believe that this discourse will actually work for the benefit of the Palestinians. Why? Because when we speak about the Palestinians, we have to make a very clear decision between their leadership that historically and habitually failed them miserably, from the Grand Mufti all the way to Mr. Abu Mazen, Mahmud Abbas, and the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people, whom I know pretty well, are ordinary people. They want what we want. They want education for their children. They want food on their table. They want health and safety. They're not waking up in the morning thinking to themselves how we're going to destroy the state of Israel. They understand that they have to reckon with Israel's presence and Israel's power. They get it. And in fact, the level of trade between the West Bank and Israel is going up all the time. When you go into the West Bank and you visit a supermarket in Ramallah, many of the products are made in Israel. It's funny that in a co-op in Brooklyn, they want to boycott a made in Israel hummus, but the Palestinians in the West Bank have no problem whatsoever with that. It's an irony. It's really an irony that some people, you know, want to boycott. You see more animosity towards Israel in certain places in the West than in the West Bank. So we have to make the distinction between the leadership that failed them and the ordinary person who really wants good life. And so when you ask me what would be the impact of the Abraham Accords on the future Palestinian leadership, it will force them to be more pragmatic, meaning take what they give you. Don't say all or nothing, as they all said, from the Grand Mufti through Yasser Arafat all the way to Abu Mazen. All or nothing, you're going to stay with nothing. And that's the most important lesson of what is happening now in the Middle East. The Palestinians right now ended up with nothing. And I think that they have a wonderful opportunity when there's a new administration coming in. And if they will continue with their intransigence, with their stubbornness, saying all or nothing, again, they'll end up with nothing. And it's not good for them, and it's not good for Israel, by the way. They could have been in a much better situation if they had been a little bit more pragmatic.
And a very small follow-up, are you seeing rising a group of pragmatic future Palestinian leaders?
Yes, definitely. You see them. And again, there's going to be a struggle. We'll have to wait and see. Mr. Abu Mazen, who should get credit, by the way, and many Israelis give him credit for two things. The first is he mainstreamed nonviolence in the Palestinian public discourse, which was very important. Yasser Arafat's entire ethos was around violence. He glorified violence. Abu Mazen, Mahmud Abbas, basically said, no, violence, not the solution. So he turned it into a mainstream view. And the second thing that he did, which will be, and I think that will be his legacy, he developed a very effective relationship with Israeli security establishment. So together, Israelis and Palestinians worked very nicely under Mahmud Abbas to avert terrorist attacks and violence. Unfortunately, again, he never was able to rise to the occasion. And if he had accepted Ehud Olmert's proposal from 2008, it would have been a different Middle East today.
You know, you made a comment before that the Palestinians lost Israel's public opinion. I was always amazed, and even during intifadas, that Israel's public opinion polls would always show a large support for two-state solution. The mood there seems to change dramatically. I mean, my guess is not too many people left in Israel's body politic who are advocating or believe in a two-state solution, while here in the United States, I think, you know, most moderate to liberal Jews believe that still is, I'm one of them, still is the best overall and long-term solution for peace and stability. So there is that disconnect. So what is going on in the Israeli public opinion? And I mean, and if not a two-state solution, what do you see as an alternate path to achieving peace and stability?
So, excellent question. The second intifada is the key to understand what happened here. The Palestinians lost Israeli public opinion during the second intifada. The second intifada was orchestrated, unfortunately, by Yasser Arafat. As I said before, the idea was to attack Israel's soft underbelly, realizing that they cannot destroy Israel militarily. They wanted to destroy Israel's economy by destroying Israeli tourism, by attacking Israeli shopping centers, by attacking Israeli buses, and so on and so forth. buses exploded here day in and day out. It really traumatized Israeli society. I remember at the time I was in New York, you can imagine the Second Intifada started in September of the year 2000, a year before 9/11. I arrived in New York in July of 9/11, in July of 2001, 2 months later, 9/11. And you can imagine the kind of trauma that the world had experienced, and the Israelis looking what's happening in New York, looking what's happening here. And the Intifada lasted for 5 years. I remember calling my brother, who was telling me that he was taking his daughters to school and he was giving them instructions what to do when there's a bombing. He's giving his daughters instructions before they get off the car. And I remember talking to my brother about this on the phone. Isn't it insane that I have to give my kids instructions what to do when there's a bomb? It became part of life. So what happened was something very simple. Israelis started to question the basic tenet of the territorial compromise concept. Is it really about Palestinian statehood? If it was about Palestinian statehood, then they could have had their state. So maybe it's not about Palestinian statehood. We were told all those years that the unfinished business is the Six-Day War, which was over territory. But now, more and more Israelis started realizing that the unfinished business was not 68, it was not 67, it was 48, which was over Israel's very right to exist. And indeed, when you look at the dates, at the history, the Palestine Liberation Organization was established in Egypt in 1964, 3 years before Israel took over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Because what was it exactly that Ahmad Shukeri and Yasser Arafat were set out to liberate in 64? Of course, they were set out to liberate Tel Aviv and Haifa and Jaffa, where I was born. So the Israelis, it's a paradigm shift. It took them several years, but then the paradigm shift had occurred. And today, as you pointed out so correctly, there is a very interesting paradox. The vast majority of people in Israel will tell you, yeah, two-state solution is the preferred solution. If Ben Gurion was alive today, he would have said that too. But if you ask them, what is the feasibility of the two-state solution? And the very same 70-75% that support the two-state solution will tell you zero. And it's not feasible right now, again, because of this all or nothing, zero-sum approach. And again, let's hope that the same young leadership that you see today in the Gulf and in Saudi Arabia, that is interest, they're all educated in Western universities. They all understand the new world. They're all cosmopolitan, extremely well educated and really people of the great world. And they understand the value of Israel. Let's hope that the same process will also take place in other Arab countries. You know that the daughter of the Prime Minister of Lebanon was quoted a couple of weeks ago as saying, I just don't understand why we don't have peace with Israel. And she's right. There is no reason why Israel shouldn't have peace with Lebanon. We never had any conflict with Lebanon, not over water, not over territory. The only conflict we had was with groups like PLO and now Hezbollah that came into Lebanon and took over certain parts of the country and attacked us from those territories. But we never had an issue with the Lebanese government.
I think we have one more question before we look forward and look toward what the Abraham Accords could signify for Israel in the future. I think you can give us some insight into Israeli diplomacy by speaking about the absence of any language in the Abraham Accords that acknowledges Israel as the home of the Jewish people. Is there any desire, and you're talking a lot about creativity and win-win. But I think for the average Jewish person like me, it would be so heartening to see recognition of Israel as a Jewish homeland, recognized by some of its, by some of the countries with whom now it has formal diplomatic relations. Is that part of Israeli diplomacy strategy to encourage its neighbors to recognize it as the home of the Jewish people, or is that a bit naive?
It shouldn't be. I think it's a mistake because, first of all, we have to make a decision. What about those who live in Israel who are not Jewish? We have a significant Muslim population and we have a Christian population. Israel is very proud of the fact that the Christians who live in Israel are the only ones who are protected and safe in the Middle East. And so we have to ask ourselves the question of what are we going to do with them? But I don't think it should be. And the simple reason is because a country should demonstrate and display a sufficient level of self-confidence. And when you let the other define who you are, it's a sign of lack of self-confidence. I don't need them to tell me who I am. I know who I am. I know that I am the Jewish state. And by the way, the Israel nation state law is a perfect example of a law that reflects a deep sense of lack of self-confidence. It's like that little kid that is whistling in the dark. We don't really need that. We have our Declaration of Independence, and in there it says exactly who we are, and it provides the legal foundation to everything that we have today in Israel. And I think it's a brilliant document, Israel's Proclamation of Independence. And those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, I urge you to Google it up and see how progressive this was in 1948 when they wrote it in 1948. An incredibly progressive and forthcoming document. So to your question, I wouldn't turn this into a cornerstone of Israeli diplomacy because it will really hamper achievement and advancement. We'll get stuck on this issue. I remember there were, without going into names, we had Israeli politicians that weren't really aware of what is the meaning of diplomacy, that presented all sorts of things like that. For example, one Israeli politician introduced the nonsense called the finality of all claims. Like he wanted Arafat to take responsibility for all the conflict between Muslims and Jews throughout the ages and to say, I signed an agreement with you, and that agreement will signal the end of all claims on behalf of all the Arabs. And complete baloney. But, people that are not trained diplomat and they come into policy, they make mistakes like that. I had another Israeli leader who came up with another nonsense idea. Unless you recognize the Palestinians, unless you recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, we're not going to have any agreement with you. Of course, by doing so, you're ending all possibility for future discourse. Again, complete nonsense of people that don't understand diplomacy. Diplomacy is not about winning. Diplomacy is about building relationships that will last. It's about making something working with people that matter. It's about, someone very smart said once, the only winning diplomacy is the kind of diplomacy not seeking a victory.
Rabbi Levine was bringing up the idea of the region and growing concern about Iran and the idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Is that motivating these accords and surrounding policy? There was also the recognition of the Iran nuclear agreement of the Obama administration, and Rabbi Levine had come forward in the Congregation Road of Sholem community to assert his support and found that the majority of our American-born congregants were supportive, but the Israeli-born congregants were not supportive of that, which can give us some insight, I think, into the difference between our approaches to diplomacy. And are we now, with the election of a Biden administration, thinking we're going to be returning to that kind of approach, or is there something different? I think that those are some of the highlights.
Yeah, so it's a question of defense philosophy. Let me explain. In order for your enemy to succeed attacking you, three things have to happen simultaneously. Your enemy has to be motivated, the enemy has to have the weapons to attack you, and your enemy has to have the opportunity, right? When you look at 9/11, they had all three preconditions. They had the motivation, they had the weapons, meaning the airplanes, and they had the opportunity. You had the airports that were not very well protected. Now, when you look at cultures and systems, the way they devise and design their defense philosophy, you can see that there are some cultures that say we're in this triangle of motivation, capabilities, and opportunities. Some cultures say my job is to actually deprive my potential enemies of the opportunity. Yes, I know there are people out there motivated to inflict harm on me. They may even have the weapons to do so, but my job is to make sure they don't have the opportunity to do it. And we call those places, those countries, police states, because what they do, they send scores of agents to the streets, like the Savak and the Muhabbarat and all those. And that's what's happening in North Korea. That's what's happening in Iran. That's what's happening in Syria. Some countries, like the United States, say, yes, we understand that there are people motivated to inflict harm on us. We understand that there are an abundance of opportunities for them, but unless we see the weapons, we can't do anything. And it has a lot to do with your legal structure. It has a lot to do with your constitution. We call it the smoking gun argument. And that's why when you arrive at the airport, they look through your bag looking for objects. Now, Israel is one of the unique countries in the world that is, its entire defense philosophy is based on identifying motivations. Meaning, in Israel, you're allowed to do profiling. When you arrive at the airport in Israel, they're not looking for objects. They already did 90% of the work that was needed to be done before you arrived. And when they ask you those three questions that a lot of people think they're stupid questions, the purpose of those questions is entirely different than what people think. They're looking at entirely different things. And so that's, now you take those the philosophical differences and you translate them to the question of Iran. The Obama administration said, we're going to produce an agreement that will prevent the Iranians from enriching enough uranium to produce a bomb. And again, the focus was on the weapon. That's the American philosophy. Well, Israel said, wait a second, you're not addressing the core issue, which is the motivation, what this regime stands for. Look at what they're doing before they have nuclear weapons. Look at what they did in Argentina. Look at what they're doing all over the world. They're destabilizing regimes. They're working in Syria with the leadership against the people, in Bahrain with the people against the leadership. Everywhere they go, they instigate trouble. So it's not just about nuclear. They can be bad news with biological warfare or chemical warfare. We need to address their motivation. And that was the big debate between the Israelis and the Americans. And that debate is not going to change because it's a fundamental difference in the way we see the world. You, in the United States, you have your legal constraints, your cultural constraints, and you're not going to profile people. Let me remind you that President Obama never used the term Islamic terrorism. Again, for the same reason. For the same reason. Now you go and convince Israelis, or for that matter, people that were beheaded by ISIS and their families. You go and convince them that there is no such thing as Islamic terrorism. Of course, it's a fundamental difference in the way we see the world. And it's not going to change unless, the United States will understand that there is a need to tackle the issue of what this regime is all about. And it's not just about nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons is only the means by which the Iranians, now, up until 1945, a national ethos, the national ethos here, the Zionistic national ethos here, was all about growth and construction and inclusion. What happened in 1945, two things happened that changed the national ethos of Israel. The first was, of course, the news about what happened in Europe. In 1945, this was before mass media. News traveled slowly. It took time, months, for the leaders and the people that lived here, including my parents, to fully understand what happened in Europe. The second thing that happened was in 1945, the Arab League enacted the Arab economic boycott, which was meant to suffocate and eliminate the tiny economy that those 500,000 Jews that lived here had. That changed our national ethos from one that was all about the future, that a new national ethos was introduced. In two words, I can, summarize it: never again. Now that's it's a very dramatic, twist in the plot. Never again, when you translate never again into an actual work plan, it means that there is no end to the amount of money or resources that the state of Israel is going to invest in making sure that there'll never be a second destruction of our people, a second extinction of our people. Now, when we don't have the luxury of saying, well, when the Iranians are saying that they're interested in wiping us off the map, they're not really serious about it. Since 1945, we don't have the luxury of dismissing those statements, and by the way, I want you to know that Israelis were shocked when they saw the T-shirts of the people that were storming on Capitol Hill that said 6 million was not enough. Yeah. It was a complete shock to Israelis. They didn't even think that such people existed in the United States. And so, for all those reasons, I don't think that this debate between Israel and the United States is going to end soon. It's a real deep philosophical difference.
Who's next? What is next? Are there other countries in the region like Tunisia, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Oman? There are so many. You have many neighbors that we expect will be formalizing relationships with Israel. Are there other diplomatic outcomes that we can expect that we'll be able to celebrate as a Jewish community, hopefully leading toward a more stable region? And we also know that we're a week away or so from a new administration here in the United States. So if you could give us any clues of what we might be looking at in the future.
So, I can only guess. I don't have any information. My guess is, first of all, I would urge all of us to look at what's happening with Turkey. Turkey probably will warm up its ties with Israel. The president Erdogan already said it. that that's what he wants to do, and I believe that it's in his best interest. And Israel is interested in developing ties with Turkey. Again, it will be helpful vis-a-vis Iran, but also it's an important ally. And I think that so we should first look at Turkey. Secondly, in the Maghreb, meaning in North Africa, definitely Tunisia and Algeria. No reason for Israel not to establish ties with them. I would have said Libya, but there's no structure. Libya has imploded and disintegrated into extremely divided and tribal society. We already have ties with Mauritania. We already have ties with Sudan. In the Gulf itself, of course, the Holy Grail is Saudi Arabia. I believe that there is a progress that had been achieved over there, and probably I will not be surprised if one of the first things that will happen under Biden is a formal relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia. You have Oman, where Israel already had an embassy in the past. I think we will probably hear about that renewal of relationships. And, personally, I would like to see something happening with Yemen because, my mother's family came from Yemen about 115 years ago. And I'd like to go back and see some of the, some of the villages. My daughter just finished a book about the Jews of Yemen. And it's written about my grandmother, who was a child in Yemen. So that's, and as I said before, and again, Lebanon, I really don't see a reason why not, especially when Hezbollah is now weakened by their terrible decision to side with Iran in the Syrian civil war.
I hope that for so many of you who are viewing this program that there are seeds of hope that have been planted within you since the signing of the Abraham Accords. There's so much complexity that we're living through, and we need to celebrate any achievement of peace and relationship that can lead to lasting peace. We have so much gratitude for this morning's programs. First and foremost to Magen David Adom, who helped create this amazing program led by Cindy and her team, Bonnie, Dana, and Selden. Thank you so much for putting this together. Thank you, Ambassador Aharoni, for joining us and sharing your Torah, your wisdom with our community, and well beyond to the 600 of you who have been with us this morning and the many more who will watch. To our Israel Committee, Arnie and Monica, and the amazing congregants who lead that work, to Rabbi Levine for his leadership for many decades of this community. We are so grateful to all of you for being here to learn with us this morning. And Ambassador Aharoni has generously offered to answer your questions, your follow-up questions. We knew we wouldn't be able to get to everything in our hour this morning. Tomorrow morning, you will receive a thank you email from Magen David Adom for joining or signing up for this program. There will be a contact email where you can submit questions, which will be communicated to Ambassador Aharoni, and he can answer those so that you can learn more from him as you continue to process the news of this rapidly changing world. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning.